A church divided. Catholic leaders defend the Holy Father. Others express support for a former Vatican diplomat, accusing Pope Francis of sex abuse cover-up. Under fire. Priests in Washington, D.C. meet, asking more questions about their leader, Cardinal Donald Wuerl.
America is a nation of believers who believe in the dignity of life, the glory of God, and the power of prayer.
Pro-life pledge. President Trump hosts evangelical leaders at the White House and commits to defending the unborn. We talk with someone who was there. And saying goodbye. Mourners begin to gather in Detroit to pay a final respect to the Queen of Soul. On EWTN News Nightly for Tuesday, August 28, 2018. Good evening from Washington, D.C., and thank you to those of you joining us from around the world for news from a Catholic perspective. I'm Lauren Ashburn. Tonight, a stunning new development in the fallout over the church sexual abuse scandal. Pope Benedict's personal secretary says a report that the Pope Emeritus had confirmed explosive incendiary charges by a former Vatican envoy to the U.S. against Pope Francis are untrue. This extraordinary development comes as the church is reeling from allegations by the former nuncio, Carlo Vigano, who says Pope Francis is complicit in a cover-up and should resign. Archbishop Vigano was the Pope's ambassador in Washington, D.C. from 2011 to 2016. In a letter, he alleges Francis knew of former Cardinal Theodore McCarrick's sexual misconduct starting in 2013, but rehabilitated him from sanctions Pope Benedict XVI had quietly imposed. The claims threaten to shake Francis's 5-year papacy and have also cast a spotlight on the role of this program's parent company. Edward Penton, Rome correspondent for EWTN's National Catholic Register, first broke this story. He joins us from Rome. Ed, even some church officials are saying publicly that this letter is less about allegations of a cover-up of sexual abuse and more about a liberal-conservative divide within the church, especially because they say Vigano's claims are unsubstantiated. Is this true?
Well, like in any large organization, Lauren, people differ in how matters should be handled. The now retired Archbishop Vigano has his detractors and is considered to be by some to be controversial. There was the VatiLeaks scandal, which he was important in uncovering the corruption in the Vatican. The Kim Davis affair, of course, he set that meeting up with Pope Francis when he came to America. He says in this case, his conscience dictates that the truth be known, because, and to quote him, he says the corruption has reached the very top of the church's hierarchy.
Let's talk about the hierarchy. The big questions still remain. Did the popes know about McCarrick, and when did they know it? Let's go to a New York Times story that they reported today that an EWTN board member, Tim Bush, who spoke with Vigano a few weeks ago, said the following about your publication, the National Catholic Register. Leaders of the publication, this was written in the New York Times, personally assured Mr. Bush, that the former Pope Benedict XVI had confirmed Archbishop Vigano's account. Is that true?
Well, Lauren, that's not true. We did not say to Mr. Bush that Pope Benedict confirmed Vigano's account. And again, the register has never said that Pope Benedict corroborated the nuncio's letter. Here's what is true. In July, a month before Archbishop Vigano's testimony was written, I spoke to a source close to Benedict who did confirm that Benedict remembers issuing sanctions on Cardinal McCarrick, but the source said Benedict could not recall the precise nature of those sanctions. Now, I didn't report it at the time as it was unattributed and I was seeking confirmation, but Archbishop Vigano's testimony provided that confirmation. Archbishop Georg Genswein, Benedict's personal secretary, rightly corrected, therefore, what was reported in the New York Times and calls the New York Times report that Benedict had confirmed Vigano's letter fake news.
Where does the story go from here, Ed?
Well, there's still many questions about Archbishop Vigano's testimony, as well as who knew what and when. reporters, we're all trying to get to the bottom of it. There's a lot of, quite a few unsubstantiated allegations in there which need to be uncovered. And also there's a homosexual cabal which he mentions, which also needs to be looked at, which is also very difficult, of course, to get to really uncover. And then we're also waiting to see what Pope Francis says and whether he breaks his silence, and whether after all of this there'll be an investigation. So there's a lot more to go on this story.
We will be covering this for the days and weeks to come. Edward Penton, Rome correspondent for EWTN's National Catholic Register. He broke this story. Thank you, Ed.
Thank you, Lauren.
Many Catholics want an investigation into clergy sex abuse to be led by lay professionals. They're reacting to some of the very scandals we just described, plus a Pennsylvania grand jury report that said 300 clergy abused more than 1,000 children over 70 years. And the Pope's former ambassador claims that Francis knew about allegations of sexual misconduct against McCain. Correspondent Jason Calvi hears from the faithful today.
We're talking about Jesus. His Last Supper, he gave us the priesthood. And what are these men doing with it?
Eileen Cosby, a Catholic mother, writes a letter to Pope Francis.
I believe in Archbishop Vigano. He has nothing to lose.
She wants the Holy Father to launch a sexual abuse investigation after the explosive letter from Archbishop Vigano, in which the Pope's former ambassador, who lived here, said the Pope and Cardinal Wuerl knew Archbishop McCain was an abuser.
I just drove over 100 miles to be here because I have a son who may one day enter the seminary in discernment for the priesthood, the sacrament of holy orders, the sacrifices that are needed.
Also sacrificing in the 90-degree heat, Catholic school teachers.
The Lord be with you.
This morning was the Archdiocese annual opening of schools mass. Noticeably absent, Cardinal Wuerl. Now, these teachers say it's not a protest, but a prayer test.
We are called to act with justice.
We're really here in support of the survivors of sexual abuse. And our message is really just that we're trying to lead by example for our students, letting them know that it's important that your faith and your church and your religion is open and loving and positive. So we're just trying to spread that message in particular.
Leading by example and speaking out in defense of the innocent.
We have to stand up for the priesthood. The Blessed Mother did, and we have to, especially us mothers.
But it's not just the lay people that are raising their voices tonight. The first of a series of meetings for the priests of the Archdiocese of Washington. That meeting will be taking place in this church behind me. We'll have more information about that meeting on my Twitter page. Lauren?
Correspondent Jason Calvi. Thank you, Jason. Joining me now is Dr. Joseph Capisi, professor of moral theology and ethics and executive director of the Institute for Human Ecology at the Catholic University of America. Welcome to the program.
Thank you, Lauren. Nice to be here.
We heard that Pennsylvania Attorney General this morning Josh Shapiro say, that he believes that not only has the clergy abuse hotline in his state received more than 700 calls since this report, but that the alleged cover-up stretched, in his words, and I quote, all the way up to the Vatican. What's your take?
My take is that I think that's a lot of lay people's beliefs at this point, that this goes all the way up the ladder, from the priesthood all the way right up to the Vatican. Many people have lost trust in their priests and their bishops, and in the hierarchy in their capacity to handle this issue.
Church leaders in Missouri and Illinois say they will cooperate with state investigations. Do you believe similar offenses of this magnitude have taken place all across the country?
Well, if we're talking about the offenses that like were discovered in Pennsylvania, then my guess is, yeah, probably. That was over a very long period of time, and over a very long period of time, probably priests did these kinds of things. The most heinous aspect of this, of course, is not just these offenses, but the cover-ups, right? The pushing aside of people and relocating them to other places and hiding these things. These are the things I think that contribute to the real outrage lay people feel.
So what does Francis need to do to help lay people like me and you have more faith in the church and return credibility to its leaders.
Right. I'm not sure there's any single thing anybody can do, including the Pope at this point. But obviously, transparency is going to be critical. This is why I think most people had very negative reactions to the silence in response to the interview on the plane. We need transparency, we need forthrightness, we need courage. And we need bishops to continue to step forward, because there are good bishops out there, but they need to step forward and in some cases perhaps risk their careers for this.
As you see, there is a lot of misinformation floating about in the media,
right.
But Pope Francis is remaining silent, and he is saying, journalists, it's up to you to
right.
determine what happened. And yet, if you look at the report we just had about the New York Times, they're not getting it right all of the time. So how is that a solution?
It's not a solution. And we've seen in the United States, the public is really suspicious about the press as well, right?
We're worse than lawyers. Do you know that? That's hard to do.
Yeah, and congratulations, by the way, on achieving that. That was really something else. But yeah, the public right now views as suspicious anybody. They see people sort of siding, taking sides, right and left, and they're fed up with this. This is, to some extent, the Trump phenomenon itself. The phenomenon of fake news is poisoning, the church's capacity to respond to these things. So turning it over to journalists is not going to solve the problem either.
It's going to be interesting to see whether or not an investigation comes and
right.
what we can look forward to. I hope we can have you back to talk about it. Thank you so much, Dr.
Thank you.
Joseph
My pleasure.
Capizzi, Professor of Moral Theology and Ethics at Catholic University of America.
Thank you.
The Senate Majority Leader announces he will form a panel to solicit ideas on the best way to honor the late John McCain.
It will be bipartisan, as only befits John's legacy. And come to think of it, we'd probably call it not a committee, but a gang. So I'm glad we're able to form this gang to ensure that a suitable, lasting tribute becomes a reality.
Republicans have been quiet about Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer's proposal to rename the Russell Senate Office Building after McCain. One of the other ideas is to rename the Senate Armed Services Committee room after the Arizona Republican and war hero. Sailors on the USS John McCain are also honoring the late senator by flying the American flag at half-mast. Before his time in Congress, McCain was a Navy bomber pilot. He will be buried Sunday at the U.S. Naval Academy. Defense Secretary James Mattis says the U.S. is urging Saudi Arabia to do everything possible to avoid the loss of innocent lives in Yemen. It comes after a new United Nations report accusing a Saudi-led coalition of committing war crimes, rape, and torture. Correspondent Wyatt Goolsby has more from the Pentagon. Good evening, Wyatt.
Good evening, Lauren. Secretary Mattis says U.S. support for Saudi Arabia is not unconditional, even as the Pentagon backs their fight against terrorists in Yemen. Mattis says the U.S. will do everything they can to limit civilian deaths.
We recognize the complexity of it. At no time have we felt rebuffed or ignored when we bring concerns to them.
Defense Secretary James Mattis addressing concerns today about the 3.5-year conflict between Saudi Arabia and Iranian-backed Houthi rebels in Yemen. The UN Human Rights Council says both sides are guilty of war crimes, saying they've committed torture, attacks on people's dignity, rape, recruitment, or enrollment or use of children under the age of 15.
We recognize every mistake like this is tragic in every way, but we have not seen any callous disregard by the people we're working with.
During a rare press conference at the Pentagon, Secretary Mattis also addressed topics like a proposed Space Force, Cyber Command, terrorism, and North Korea. Mattis announced they have no plans to suspend any future military exercises with South Korea. Several joint drills had been suspended this year as part of diplomatic talks with the North.
We will work very closely, as I said, with the Secretary of State, and what he needs done, we will certainly do to reinforce his effort, but at this time, there is no discussion about further suspensions.
Mattis promising those measures are not an effort to provoke North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. The secretary did, however, point the finger at Iran's leadership, accusing them of causing mischief in Iraq and Syria and supporting Syrian President Bashar Assad. Mattis vows to hold Iran's government responsible for their actions in the Middle East. Mattis touched on a number of issues important to the wider Middle East. The Pentagon is concerned about Turkey's plan to buy a Russian air defense system, for example. Mattis says the U.S. and fellow NATO allies take a dim view of such a move. Lauren?
Wyatt, did Secretary Mattis talk about the passing of Senator John McCain?
He did, Lauren. The Secretary called McCain a great patriot and says our military lost one of our most ardent supporters. He added that the senator served his country honorably as a naval officer, as a defiant prisoner of war, and as a leader in Congress. All the flags here at the Pentagon and around the nation's capital remain and have staff, and Secretary Mattis says he will attend the funeral. Lauren?
Correspondent Wyatt Goolsbee reporting from the Pentagon. Thank you, Wyatt. Investigators from the United Nations say Myanmar's military leaders should be prosecuted for genocide against Rohingya Muslims. The report uses some of the strongest language yet by officials. It estimates 10,000 people have been killed. The Muslim refugees say they welcome the news. Around 700,000 Rohingya have left the country for neighboring Bangladesh. Catholic leaders in the Democratic Republic of Congo say international observers are critical to the presidential election in December. It has been delayed several times. The nation is under pressure to ensure free and fair voting.
We should all move on and work together.
The Chief Justice on the Supreme Court in the Philippines gives her first press conference. Teresita de Castro's predecessor was ousted after criticizing President Duterte's violent war on drugs. It has left thousands of suspects dead. And also in the Philippines, a Catholic priest critical of the president says he now fears for his life. Father Amado Picardal says he was targeted by hitmen and now is in hiding at a Catholic monastery. The priest was one of the earliest critics of Duterte's deadly crackdown. British Prime Minister is dancing there with school children in Cape Town. Her 3-day trip to Africa is to establish economic and trade links. Theresa May will then be heading to Nigeria and Kenya. Coming up, President Trump talks religious freedom in a meeting with evangelical leaders at the White House. We will talk to someone who was there. President Trump tells Christian leaders that faith and family are, quote, the center of American life, and he promises to work with them to defend the unborn and to defend religious freedom.
As you know, in recent years, the government tried to undermine religious freedom. But the attacks on communities of faith are over. We've ended it. We've ended it.
President Trump and the First Lady hosted dozens of evangelicals to a White House dinner last night. Trump says their support has been incredible, but says he doesn't feel guilty, quote, because I have given you a lot back. The Pew Research Center says 78% of evangelicals support Trump. Joining me now is Eric Metaxas, host of The Eric Metaxas Show. Eric attended last night's White House dinner. Welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
Last night you tweeted out this picture with Vice President and Mrs. Pence and Kellyanne and saying, just hang them at dinner with some friends.
Well, it's a funny thing because I am so honored to be there that you don't even know how to take it in. You think to yourself, this is such an honor, so I don't want to crow about it because I feel like I don't deserve to be here any more than anybody does. You just feel like it's an honor.
Well, did it surprise you that the president threw a dinner for just evangelicals?
It wasn't only a dinner, it was effectively a state dinner. It was in the room and with all of the accoutrement that you find at an actual state dinner. Melania Trump, the First Lady, wanted it to be that way, and she oversaw all of those details. So it's startling. To me, it's heartening that the president takes people of faith seriously. And by the way, I should say, since I'm on EWTN, you know, I, as a Christian, I always want to represent all Christians. And I think when we're talking about religious liberty, when we're talking about the unborn, that's not just evangelicals. I don't need to tell you or your audience. Those are issues that are vital to so many Americans and especially Christians.
What about critics who say, hey, separation of church and state, what are we doing having evangelicals in a quote-unquote state dinner?
There are two issues. First of all, the separation of church and state was set up to protect the church from the state co-opting it, right? So because we know in the colonial era, some states, or in Europe, they would say you either have to be Protestant or you have to be Catholic or you have to be a member of this church or that church, or you can't be a member of any church. So that's really a separate issue. Whether power is tempting and corrupting, we know that it is. And I think that when you know, the Bible is really clear that you have to be very, very careful about that. At the same time, I think everybody in America who has serious Christian faith, and again, Catholics, evangelicals, they know that in the past administrations have pretty much kicked us and our concerns to the curb. I was deadly afraid of what would happen to religious liberty under Hillary Clinton, deadly afraid. And so I think that at the same time that you have to be wary of cozying up to power, you have to understand that to some extent, having faith is political.
Is there anything that this president could do that would make evangelicals not support him?
Would not support him? Mm-hmm. I think there's an infinity of things that he could do that would make evangelicals not support him. I mean, let's say he came out and said, hey, I don't think it makes any difference whether people cheat on their wives. Or let's say he did something like that in the White House, the way previous presidents, JFK, and obviously Clinton. I mean, I do think that there are many, many things. And so people who think that evangelicals are supporting him for the power do not know me or my friends. I mean, that is something that we're very aware of. And I think that nothing in my mind could be further from the truth. God forbid that that would be the case.
Before we let you go, we want to talk about your new book, Donald Drains the Swamp. When I first read it, I thought, oh, intellectual, that would be, it's a children's book parody. What are you doing? Yeah. He's a caveman.
Yeah, he's a caveman. Listen, I've written 30 children's books. I wrote for Veggie Tales. I've written a lot of humor. And so this is really, it's a humor book for adults, but it's really so much, it's in the guise of a children's book. And then I realized it is appropriate as a children's book. It's very sweet. It's not making mean political points. It's a sweet fable, and we all know, like, hey, he's kind of a caveman, isn't he? And so it's meant to be funny. I think, listen, in these divided times, we need to laugh a little bit, and Donald Drains the Swamp, it's a fable for everybody, and I do tell people that if they order it now, they can they're entered into a contest to pre-order, because it's not out yet.
Right.
But you're entered in a contest to have dinner with me and all kinds of cool stuff. So,
in New York.
It's meant to be in New York or wherever, or here, because I come here sometimes too.
Great. So it's out in October?
In October, Donald Drains the Swamp.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Eric Metaxas, host of The Eric Metaxas Show.
Thank you.
First Lady Melania Trump is putting down roots at the White House, so to speak. Yesterday, she helped plant a baby Eisenhower oak tree on the South grounds. It replaces one that fell during a violent storm last March. She was joined by descendants of past presidents, including the granddaughter of Dwight Eisenhower and a fifth-generation grandson of James Monroe. Up next, mourners gather in Detroit to show respect to the Queen of Soul. And a Bolivian woman reaches a major milestone. The Bishop of San Jose, on second thought, says he will not live in a $2.3 million home bought for him by the diocese. Bishop Patrick McGrath tells the San Jose Mercury News he plans instead to live at the rectory at a local church. It was a joint decision by the bishop and the diocese to purchase the 3,300 square foot home, and it raised concerns among some Catholics. The diocese says it is going to sell the house and donate the profits to charity. Mourners are beginning to pay their final respects to the Queen of Soul. Aretha Franklin's body will lay in repose today and tomorrow at the Detroit Museum of African American History. Hundreds of fans camped out for hours, even days. Franklin died earlier this month of pancreatic cancer. She was 76. Her funeral is Friday. Finally tonight, this is one woman who is proud of her age. Julia Flores Colque from Bolivia is nearly 118 years old. She is considered the oldest woman in the world. In her lifetime, her hometown has gone from 3,000 people to 175,000. Colque particularly likes singing folk songs, as you can see her here. And of course, eating good cake. Don't we all like to eat good cake? For all of us here at EWTN News Nightly, and I think I eat too much good cake on top of that. To all of you around the world, thank you for watching. I'm Lauren Ashburn. Let's keep in touch online. Follow me at Lauren Ashburn on Twitter and Lauren Ashburn EWTN on Facebook. Good night, and God bless you.